Smoke curls from the smouldering ruins of what was once a monastery, its stone walls blackened by fire, its wooden structures reduced to ash. Bodies lie strewn across the bloodied earth, monks in their tattered robes, warriors who tried to defend them, all still and silent now. The raiders move methodically through the carnage, their swords and axes dripping, their faces impassive beneath metal helms. They are not frenzied anymore. The killing frenzy has passed. Now comes the cold, calculated aftermath. A woman's scream pierces the air, then another, and another. The real story of the Viking Age begins when the cheering stops and the fires burn low. When the famous berserker rage subsides and the practical business of conquest takes over. This is the moment when history falls silent in our textbooks, when the chronicles written by monks grow vague, when the sagas penned by skalds turn to boasts and away from the uncomfortable truth. This is not a tale of glorious battle. This is what happens after. A young woman is dragged by her hair across the courtyard, her hands bound with rope. An older woman, perhaps her mother, lunges toward her captor, only to be struck down with a casual backhand. A child wails, clutching at a dead man's tunic. The raiders ignore the child, too young to be of value. But the women are gathered, assessed, bound. "Take them to the ships," orders a grey-bearded man, his cloak fastened with a silver brooch that catches the firelight. The young ones first. What follows isn't recorded in the heroic poems. It doesn't appear in the simplified history taught in schools, yet it shaped the genetics, politics and social structures of medieval Europe as profoundly as any battle or treaty. The systematic capture, enslavement and forced marriage of women during the Viking Age represents one of history's most deliberate demographic engineering projects. A centuries-long transfer of female populations that rewrote bloodlines from Dublin to Kiev. This isn't speculation. It's written in the law codes that dictated how captive women could be claimed and distributed. It's preserved in the archaeological record, in shackles sized for female wrists, in mass graves where women and children lie together, in the very DNA of populations across the North Atlantic. It's documented in the matter-of-fact accounts of Arab travellers who visited the slave markets of the Rus, and in the desperate letters of ransom sent by Anglo-Saxon nobles trying to recover their daughters and wives. The Vikings, those seafaring Norse warriors who terrorised Europe from the late 8th to the 11th centuries, weren't just after gold and silver. Human cargo, particularly women, represented their most valuable and sustainable resource. A monastery's treasures might finance a season. A shipload of women could establish generational wealth and power. By the end of this journey, we'll uncover the most chilling aspect of this system. The evidence that Vikings sometimes killed their own women, rather than allow them to be captured by enemies. Excavations at sites like Repton in England have revealed mass graves where Norse women were executed, not by their conquerors, but by their own people. A final terrible assertion of control. This is the dark machinery behind the Viking expansion. Not just ships and swords, but a calculated system for acquiring, transporting, and exploiting women that fueled their colonies and their wealth. The gleaming treasures in museum displays were purchased with human lives. The legendary settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and beyond were populated through systematic abduction. As we explore the evidence left behind, from the dry language of law codes to the mute testimony of bones, we'll reconstruct this hidden history. We'll examine how women became the spoils of war, how their bodies became battlegrounds, and how their stolen lives became the foundation of a new social order across the North Atlantic world. The story begins not with the clash of swords, but with their falling silent. Not with the battle cry, but with the aftermath. Not with conquest, but with what conquest made possible. The systematic transformation of women into property, into currency, into the spoils of war. Aftermath of battle. The first light of dawn reveals what darkness had mercifully hidden. The monastery of Lindisfarne lies in ruins, smoke still rising from its collapsed timber structures. The year is 793, and the world has just changed forever. This raid on England's northeastern coast marks the beginning of what historians would later call the Viking Age. But the monks who recorded it were less concerned with historical periodization than with the horror they witnessed. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain," wrote Alcuin of York, a scholar at Charlemagne's court, upon hearing the news. "Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." What Alcuin doesn't describe in detail, what most chronicles gloss over, is what happened to the survivors. Archaeological evidence fills this silence. At Lindisfarne and countless other sites across Europe, the pattern becomes clear. Adult males killed, older women and children often left behind, and young women conspicuously absent from burial sites. They weren't just killed, they were taken. By 821, when Vikings struck Étir on the Irish coast, their operations had evolved. Contemporary accounts describe the raid with chilling efficiency. The heathens carried off many women captive. No mention of gold or silver, just women. The shift from treasure to people as the primary target of Viking raids represents not a change in moral character, but a cold economic calculation. A woman of childbearing age could produce children who would become slaves, explains Dr. Judith Jesch, Professor of Viking Studies at the University of Nottingham. This made them renewable resources in a way that gold and silver were not. The economics are brutally simple. The archaeological record at Étir confirms this shift in priorities. Excavations in the 1990s revealed defensive structures hastily constructed after the initial raid, not to protect treasures, but to create safe houses for women and children. These defences show evidence of being overrun in subsequent attacks. More telling are the mass graves dating to this period, containing primarily male remains, many showing defensive wounds on hands and forearms. The women are largely missing from these burial sites. At Port Mahomet in Scotland, a Pictish monastery raided around 800 CE, archaeologists discovered evidence of intense destruction affecting multiple parts of the site. The treasury was looted, but the overall damage pattern suggests raiders systematically targeted valuable resources rather than attacking randomly. Dr. Martin Carver, who led the excavation, explains the raiders knew what mattered here. This wasn't simple chaos. They focused on wealth and captives, striking hard where it would hurt most. The economic logic becomes clear when we examine the broader pattern of Viking settlement. Initial raids gave way to more permanent presence, particularly in places like Ireland, northern England, and parts of Scotland. These weren't just military outposts. They were colonies that needed population growth to survive and thrive. The Annals of Ulster record that by 837, the Vikings had established a long fort, ship fortress, at Dublin, a base that would grow into one of the largest slave markets in Europe. Excavations at Wood Quay in Dublin revealed extensive facilities for holding captives. Buildings with unusual security features, heavy doors, small barred windows, and drainage systems designed for spaces housing many people in confined conditions. But perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from ship burials. At Skar-on-Orkney, archaeologists discovered a Viking boat burial containing 3 individuals: an elderly man, a younger man, and a woman in her 20s. The men were buried with weapons and status items. The woman, who DNA analysis indicated was not related to either man, was buried with a whalebone plaque, a tool used for flattening linen. She was a textile worker, likely captured from a Celtic community, who lived and died as part of the Norse household. Her presence tells us something important, says Dr. James Barrett of the University of Cambridge. She represents the thousands of women who were integrated into Norse society, not as equals, but as workers, concubines, and forced wives. They weren't always kept as what we would recognise as slaves. Many were absorbed into households in various capacities. The physical evidence of violence against women during and after raids is often striking. At Knip on the Isle of Lewis, excavations revealed a female skeleton buried face down in an unusual position. Some scholars suggest this might indicate captivity, or mistreatment, while others caution that unusual burial practices can arise from multiple causes, not always deliberate punishment. At Oldham in East Lothian, a mass grave contained the remains of local people killed during a raid, but with a telling demographic gap. Women between 15 and 30 were significantly underrepresented among the dead. They weren't spared out of mercy. The pattern repeats across the Viking world. At Lons Meadows in Newfoundland, the short-lived Norse settlements at the edge of the known world, archaeologists found evidence of female-associated activities, textile production, dairy processing. But the artefacts cannot confirm the women's cultural identity. Whether they were Norse or from other groups remains uncertain. Contemporary accounts from those who witnessed Viking raids firsthand describe the systematic nature of these abductions. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that after the Battle of Maldon in 991, the Vikings demanded tribute that included maidens alongside gold and silver. The Irish Cogad Gaedel Rigalaib, the War of the Irish with the foreigners, describes Vikings who carried off a great host of them as captives to their ships. More telling is what happened to these captives. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Viking traders on the Volga River in 922, described their treatment of slave women in explicit terms. Each man takes a slave girl and has sex with her, while his companions look on. Sometimes a group of them comes together to do this, each in front of the other. This wasn't just the chaos of war or the excesses of warriors far from home. It was a system, organised, deliberate, and economically rational. The aftermath of battle wasn't simply about counting the dead and dividing the loot. It was about securing human resources for a colonial enterprise that spanned continents. By the mid-9th century, the pattern had become institutionalised. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 wasn't just a military force, it was a migration, with warriors bringing families and establishing settlements. But they needed more women than they brought with them. The chronicles record that after taking York in 866, the Vikings settled there and divided the land. What they don't explicitly say, but what archaeology confirms, is that they also divided the women. Excavations at Coppergate in York revealed a thriving Norse settlement with a significantly mixed population. Textile implements, typically associated with women's work, show both Norse and Anglo-Saxon styles, suggesting women from the local population were incorporated into Viking households. The skeletal evidence tells an even more direct story. At Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, a mass grave of executed Viking warriors included isotope analysis, showing they came from different parts of Scandinavia. But in Viking settlements, female skeletal remains often show local isotope signatures, indicating they were not immigrants but captives. The Vikings didn't just take gold that would eventually be spent, explains archaeologist Dr. Kat Jarman. They took women who would produce children, labour and stability for their settlements. It was a deliberate demographic strategy. This strategy reached its apex in Iceland, where genetic studies have revealed a striking pattern. While the male DNA is predominantly Norse, approximately 60% of the female genetic material comes from Celtic populations, specifically from areas heavily raided by Vikings. This isn't evidence of peaceful intermarriage, it's the genetic signature of systematic abduction. As the fires of battle cooled and the dead were counted, the real work of conquest began. Women were gathered, evaluated and allocated, some destined for slave markets in Dublin or Constantinople, others for Norse households as domestic slaves, concubines or forced wives. Their children would become the next generation of Vikings, carrying their mother's genes but raised in their father's culture. The aftermath of the battle wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Captive women as property. The sun rises over a thing assembly in the 10th century Iceland. Men have gathered from across the region to settle disputes, establish laws and conduct the business of their fledgling society. Among the matters being discussed is a conflict between two settlers over a woman. a captive taken during a raid on Ireland years before. Both men claim her as property. This scene, reconstructed from accounts in the Icelandic sagas, illustrates how the fate of captive women was governed not by chaos or individual whim, but by elaborate legal frameworks. The Norse world was not lawless. It was meticulously regulated by codes that specified exactly how human property could be acquired, claimed and transferred. The Gragars, Iceland's grey goose laws, and Norway's Gulathing law provide extraordinary insight into this system. These weren't just guidelines, they were comprehensive legal codes that devoted considerable attention to the status of women, particularly those brought into Norse society through capture or purchase. The law codes are brutally matter-of-fact, explains legal historian Dr. Stefan Brink. They discuss captive women in the same sections that cover livestock and land, as property to be regulated, not as people with rights. The Gulathing law, compiled in western Norway around the 10th century, contains detailed provisions about women acquired through raid or purchase. Some passages suggest captors had limited time to assert claims over women before others could dispute ownership, though the specifics vary across manuscripts and regions. Scholars debate how uniform these customs were across the Norse world. What matters is the principle. Norse law often transformed violent seizure into formal property rights through legal ritual. Once claimed within the accepted framework, a woman passed from captive to recognised concubine, wife or thrall. The law thus provided social and economic legitimacy to what had begun as an act of war and coercion. The Gragars takes this further, specifying the exact compensation due if someone interferes with another man's female property. If a man takes a man's wife away, whether she consents or not, he shall pay the husband 3 marks. If he takes away a man's daughter or sister or mother, he shall pay the appropriate man 3 marks. Notice the language. The offence isn't against the woman, but against the man who owns her. The compensation goes not to her, but to him. The woman's consent is explicitly irrelevant. More revealing still are the inheritance laws. The Gragar specifies that children born to captive women inherited their mother's status unless their father formally freed them. If a man has a child by his concubine, Frilla, that child has no right to inheritance unless the father acknowledges it and frees the mother. This created a powerful mechanism for controlling captive women. Their children's future depended entirely on their compliance and their captor's goodwill. Archaeological evidence from settlements in Dublin, York and Iceland shows that many children of mixed parentage were indeed raised as full members of Norse society, creating a pathway for captive women to secure better treatment through motherhood. The economic valuation of women is made explicit in multiple law codes. The Gulathing law assigns specific monetary values to women based on status and age. A freeborn woman is valued at 12 ounces of silver. A thrall woman is valued at 1 mark, 8 ounces, if she is young and healthy. These weren't abstract figures. They established compensation rates for killing or injuring women, set bride prices for marriages, and determined fines for sexual offences. They created, in effect, a human commodity market with standardised pricing. The sagas, those semi-historical narratives of early Norse society, provide vivid illustrations of how these laws played out in practice. In Laxdæla's saga, Melkorka, an Irish princess captured in a raid, is purchased by the Icelandic chieftain Hoskuld for 1 mark of silver. Though initially intended as a concubine, she eventually gains influence through her son Olaf, who becomes a powerful figure in Iceland. Melkorka's story highlights another aspect of captive women's experience: the use of language barriers to control them. The saga relates that Melkorka pretends to be mute for years, only revealing her ability to speak when she wants her son to know his royal Irish heritage. Archaeological evidence supports this narrative element. Items like small personal tokens of Celtic origin have been found in Norse women's graves in Iceland, suggesting captives maintained some connection to their original identities despite forced assimilation. The legal status of captive women evolved over time and varied by region. In early Viking settlements, they were often kept as thralls, slaves, with few rights. As Norse society developed, particularly in places like Iceland where labour was scarce, many captive women were incorporated into households through forced marriage or concubinage, statuses that offered slightly more protection than outright slavery. The boundary between slave, concubine and wife was fluid, explains historian Dr. Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir. A woman might begin as a thrall, become a concubine if she caught her owner's interest, and eventually be recognised as a secondary wife if she bore children or proved valuable to the household. This progression is documented in the saga of Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, who begins as a captive, becomes a concubine, and eventually gains recognition as a wife with certain legal protections. While her story is presented as a rise in status, it remains fundamentally a narrative of forced incorporation. The laws governing forced marriage were particularly elaborate. The Gulathing law states, "If a man takes a woman by force and witnesses can prove it, he shall pay full compensation to her legal guardian and make peace with the king, with 40 marks." Note that the crime isn't the forced marriage itself, but doing so without compensating her male relatives. If proper payment was made, the marriage became legal, regardless of the woman's wishes. This legal framework created a market for women as political currency. In Egil's saga, the warrior Egil raids in Courland, modern Latvia, and captures several women. Rather than keeping them, he presents them as gifts to allies in Norway, strengthening political bonds. The women's transfer is described in the same terms as the exchange of swords, silver, and other valuable goods. Archaeological evidence confirms this practice. At Skar on Orkney, the boat burial mentioned earlier included not just the local woman with her whalebone plaque, but also Baltic amber beads, suggesting she had been transported across vast distances from the Baltic region to the Scottish Isles, as part of this human exchange network. The use of captive women as diplomatic currency appears repeatedly in historical records. When the Viking leader Rollo negotiated the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte in 911, establishing what would become Normandy, part of the agreement included his marriage to Gisela, daughter of the French king Charles the Simple. While described as a diplomatic marriage, Gisela had no choice in the arrangement. She was effectively a high-status captive used to seal a political deal. The law codes also regulated sexual access to captive women with disturbing precision. The Gragas states, "If a man forces a thrall woman belonging to another man, he shall pay her owner 1 ounce of silver, and no more unless injury results." The nominal fine wasn't meant to protect the woman, but to compensate her owner for using his property without permission. Physical evidence of these laws in practice comes from excavations across the Viking world. At Birka in Sweden, a trading centre active from the 8th to 10th centuries, archaeologists discovered small iron keys associated with women's graves. These weren't just household items, they were symbols of the husfreyja, housewife role, indicating control over domestic resources. Significantly, these status symbols appear almost exclusively in graves of women with Norse genetic markers, not in graves of women with non-Norse origins. The keys tell us something important, says archaeologist Dr. Neil Price. They show that household authority, the limited power available to women in Norse society, was reserved primarily for freeborn Norse women, not for those brought in through capture. The control of captive women extended beyond their labour and reproductive capacity to their very identities. The sagas record that captives were typically given Norse names, forced to adopt Norse clothing, and required to worship Norse gods. The Landnámabók, Book of Settlements, mentions numerous instances where Irish captive women were renamed with Norse names like Melkorka or Thorgerda, erasing their original identities. Archaeological evidence supports this narrative. At Viking settlements in Dublin, combs, brooches, and other personal items show a transition from Celtic to Norse styles, suggesting captive women were required to adopt the appearance of their captor's culture. More poignantly, amulets and small personal religious items of Christian origin have been found hidden in hearths and under floorboards in Norse households, silent testimony to captive women maintaining their faith in secret. The legal status of children born to captive women created another layer of control. According to the Gulathing law, if a thrall woman bears a child to her master, the child shall be raised as a slave, unless the father chooses to free it. This created a powerful incentive for captive women to please their captors. Their children's freedom hung in the balance. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains from Viking settlements reveals the human reality behind these laws. At Hofstadr in Iceland, researchers found that many children buried with full Norse funeral rites had mothers who grew up in Scotland or Ireland, their isotope signatures proving they were not born in Scandinavia or Iceland. These children, likely born to captive mothers but recognised by their Norse fathers, were raised as full members of Norse society, despite their maternal origins. The Norse legal system's approach to captive women wasn't unique in medieval Europe, but it was unusually systematic and explicit. Where other legal traditions might obscure the status of captured women through euphemism or religious justification, Norse law addressed it directly as a matter of property rights and economic value. What makes the Norse system distinctive, explains legal historian Dr. Torsten Iversen, is not that they captured and exploited women, many societies did that, but that they created such an elaborate legal framework to regulate it. This wasn't opportunistic raiding, it was a carefully managed system for acquiring and controlling female populations. By the late Viking Age, this system had transformed the demographic makeup of Norse settlements across the North Atlantic. In Iceland, the Orkney Islands, parts of Scotland, and the Isle of Man, genetic studies show populations with predominantly Norse, male ancestry, but substantial Celtic female ancestry, the biological legacy of centuries of systematic capture and forced marriage. The laws that made women into property didn't just regulate individual relationships, they engineered entire societies. The slave economy. The wooden quays of Dublin creak under the weight of human cargo. Ships from Norway, Denmark and the Scottish Isles unload their latest acquisitions. People bound in chains, most of them women. Merchants assess the new arrivals, checking teeth, testing muscles, evaluating childbearing potential. Prices are negotiated, silver changes hands, and the captives are led away to warehouses where they'll await their fate. Transportation east to the markets of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, or distribution to Norse settlements needing labourers and wives. This scene, reconstructed from archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts, played out countless times in Dublin between the 9th and 11th centuries. The Viking settlement at Dublin, established in 841, quickly grew into one of the largest slave markets in Europe, a hub in a vast network that transported captives from raids in Britain, Ireland and Francia to buyers across the known world. Dublin wasn't just a trading post, explains archaeologist Dr. Pat Wallace, who directed excavations at Wood Quay. The evidence shows it became a major hub for slave traffic during the Viking Age. Excavations revealed buildings with heavy doors, narrow windows and secure interiors, suggesting they held people as well as goods. Drainage systems and crowded living conditions point to captivity on a significant scale, though whether all facilities were designed solely for slaves remains debated among archaeologists. More telling still are the shackles, chains and restraints found throughout the settlement, many sized specifically for female wrists and ankles. The volume of restraint equipment we found suggests this wasn't occasional activity, Wallace notes. It was Dublin's primary business. The scale of this human trafficking operation was enormous. Contemporary accounts suggest that by the 10th century, Dublin was processing thousands of captives annually. The Annals of Ulster record that in 871, a single Viking raid on Dumbarton in Scotland yielded a great prey of women who were brought to Dublin for processing and sale. Archaeological evidence confirms these written accounts. At Kilmainham Island Bridge, a Viking cemetery near Dublin, excavations revealed over 40 warrior graves equipped with weapons and tools of their trade, including slave shackles and specialised knives for marking human property. These weren't just raiders, they were professionals in a sophisticated slave economy. The economics of this trade were carefully calculated. Rune-inscribed trade records found at Björkö in Sweden and similar trading centres document the standardised pricing of human captives. Women were categorised by age, appearance, skills and reproductive capacity, with prices adjusted accordingly. A young woman of childbearing age might fetch twice the price of an older woman with specialised skills like weaving or medicine. These weren't just random valuations, explains economic historian Dr. Dagfinn Skre. They reflected cold market calculations about the return on investment each captive represented. The Dublin slave market connected to a vast international network. While some captives remained within the Norse world, many were transported east along river routes through Russia to markets in Constantinople and Baghdad. The primary eastern route, known as the Osterwege or East Way, followed the Dnieper River through what is now Ukraine to the Black Sea and beyond. Archaeological evidence of this route includes ship manifests inscribed on wooden tally sticks found at Staraya Ladoga in Russia. These records, dating to the 9th century, list human cargo alongside other commodities like furs, honey, and amber. Women consistently appear as the highest value items in these manifests. Arab sources provide the most detailed descriptions of this trade. Ibn Hawqal, a 10th century Arab geographer, wrote, "The Rus Vikings have no fields, but simply live off what they can take from the Sakaliba, Slavic lands. They have no occupation other than trading in sables and slaves." Even more explicit is the account of Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Viking traders on the Volga River in 922. He described their treatment of female slaves in disturbing detail. Each Rus takes a female slave and puts her in a hut. When a merchant arrives to buy a slave girl, he inspects her. If he wants to buy her, he inspects her private parts and sometimes her face. The archaeological record confirms these written accounts. At Gnezdovo, a Viking trading post on the Dnieper route, excavations revealed holding pens for captives and specialised equipment for restraining and transporting humans. Similar facilities have been found at Viking trading centres throughout Eastern Europe, from Staraya Ladoga in Russia to Hedeby in Denmark. The economic importance of the slave trade to Viking society cannot be overstated. Analysis of silver hoards found throughout Scandinavia shows that much of the wealth that fueled the Viking Age came from the sale of human captives. The distinctive Islamic dirhams that dominate many Viking treasure hoards, like the Cuerdale hoard in England, with over 7,000 silver coins, came primarily from the Eastern slave trade. Slavery wasn't just one aspect of the Viking economy, explains economic historian Dr. Ben Raffield. For many communities, it was the primary source of wealth. The magnificent silver hoards we find in Scandinavia were largely paid for with human lives. Dublin's role as a slave processing centre is confirmed by physical evidence of the captives themselves. At Kilmainham, excavations revealed a mass grave containing over 30 individuals, primarily young women and adolescent girls, who died while awaiting sale. Isotope analysis of their remains showed they originated from various parts of Britain and Ireland, brought together in death as they had been in captivity. More telling still are the marks of bondage on their skeletons. Many showed evidence of healed fractures to wrists and ankles, injuries consistent with being kept in restraints for extended periods. Some displayed signs of malnutrition and disease, indicating the harsh conditions of their captivity. Others bore evidence of violence, broken bones that had healed poorly, suggesting they had been beaten or subdued with force. The skeletons tell a story the written records often omit, says bioarchaeologist Dr. Bara O. Donapayan. They show us the physical reality of captivity, the restraints, the violence, the deprivation. The slave economy wasn't limited to Dublin. Similar processing centres operated throughout the Viking world. Archaeological evidence from Kaupang in Norway, Hedeby in Denmark, and Birka in Sweden shows these settlements also participated in human trafficking, though none matched Dublin's scale and specialisation. At Borgund in Norway, excavations revealed a Viking Age building with unusual security features and a concentration of shackles and restraints. Analysis of soil samples from the floor showed elevated levels of human waste products, suggesting many people were held there in confined conditions. Similar facilities have been found at Kaupang and other coastal trading centres. The economic value of female captives varied based on their intended use. Those destined for domestic slavery or agricultural labour were typically sold locally. Those with specialised skills like textile production commanded higher prices and might be transported to Norse settlements needing such expertise. The most valuable, young women selected for the eastern markets, could fetch prices equivalent to several kilograms of silver. This valuation system is documented in trading records from Novgorod, where birchbark documents from the Viking Age list prices for different categories of slaves. A young woman described as suitable for the Baghdad market was valued at 40 silver grivnas, roughly 8 times the price of a male agricultural labourer. The logistics of transporting human cargo presented challenges that shaped Viking ship design. The Karvi, a medium-sized longship, was modified with additional below-deck space, specifically for transporting captives. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks like Skuldelev, one shows these vessels could hold 20 to 30 captives, along with a crew of 30 warriors, an efficient design for both raiding and human trafficking. The conditions during transport were brutal. Ibn Rusta, a 10th century Persian explorer, described Viking slave ships. They bind the captives in chains and transport them to their lands, where they sell them. Many die on the journey from thirst, hunger and exposure. This account is supported by archaeological evidence. The Gokstad ship burial in Norway included the remains of human captives sacrificed to accompany their master in death. Analysis of these remains showed signs of malnutrition and stress markers consistent with long-distance transport in harsh conditions. The slave economy created specialised roles within Viking society. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson mentions mannbjörg, a term sometimes interpreted as people involved in managing captives during raids. Archaeologists have found restraints and tools in some warrior graves, though whether these indicate dedicated slave-catching specialists remains debated. Some scholars see them as multi-purpose equipment rather than proof of a distinct professional role. These weren't just warriors who occasionally took slaves, explains archaeologist Dr. Neil Price. These were professionals in a specialised trade with specific tools and techniques for capturing, controlling and transporting human beings. The processing of captives followed standardised procedures documented in both written accounts and archaeological evidence. Upon arrival at markets like Dublin, captives were cleaned. Their heads were shaved to prevent lice. Evidence for this comes from concentrations of hair found in waste pits near slaveholding areas, and they were marked with ownership symbols. Some Viking Age burials show possible evidence of tattooing or scarification, including a female skeleton at Frøyel on Gotland with marks on the forehead. While some link this to descriptions in Arab accounts, others caution that its exact purpose or meaning remains uncertain. The economic impact of the slave trade extended beyond direct sales. In Norse settlements across the North Atlantic, captive women provided essential labour for textile production, one of the Vikings' most important exports. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland includes large concentrations of spindle, whorls and loom weights, indicating intensive textile production by captive women. The wool trade depended on female slave labour, explains textile archaeologist Dr. Penelope Walton-Rogers. Without captive women to process wool and weave cloth, the Vikings couldn't have produced the high-quality textiles that were so important to their economy. This economic reality created a self-reinforcing cycle. Raids captured women who produced textiles, which were sold for silver, which funded ships and warriors for more raids. The system was brutally efficient. By the late Viking Age, Dublin's slave markets had begun to decline as Christian prohibitions against enslaving fellow Christians gained influence. The Dublin slave trade didn't end abruptly, however. It adapted. Increasingly, captives were sourced from pagan populations in the Baltic and Slavic regions, maintaining the flow of human merchandise while respecting religious boundaries. The legacy of this vast slave economy persists in the archaeological and genetic record. Across the Viking world, from Dublin to Novgorod, the physical infrastructure of human trafficking, the holding pens, the processing facilities, the specialized restraints, testifies to a sophisticated system that treated people as commodities. More lasting still is the genetic legacy. DNA studies of populations across the North Atlantic reveal the biological imprint of centuries of forced migration. Celtic maternal lineages combined with Norse paternal ancestry, creating new populations born of conquest and captivity. The slave markets of Dublin and other Viking trading centres weren't just economic institutions. They were engines of demographic change, forcibly redistributing women across Europe and beyond, forever altering the human landscape of the medieval world. Noble women and ransom politics. The cathedral at Canterbury burns against the night sky. Inside, Archbishop Elfhere refuses to flee, standing firm as Viking raiders storm through the sacred space. The year is 1011, and the city has fallen after a 3-week siege. What happens next is recorded with unusual detail in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The Vikings take hostage all the men in orders and husbands and wives and children, but they are selective in their captives. Specifically mentioned are abbesses, priests, monks and women of noble birth, who are bound and led away to the waiting ships. This wasn't random violence, it was a calculated strategy. The capture of high-status women, noble women, abbesses, queens and princesses, represented a specialised form of Viking raiding with political rather than economic objectives. These women weren't destined for slave markets or forced marriage to common warriors. They were political assets, living collateral in a sophisticated system of ransom diplomacy that shaped European politics for centuries. The taking of noble hostages wasn't incidental to Viking strategy, explains historian Dr. Eleanor Parker. It was central to it. These captives were more valuable, conscious, well-treated and alive than they would have been as conventional slaves. The Canterbury raid exemplifies this approach. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that after capturing the city's elite, the Vikings demanded an enormous ransom, £48,000 of silver. This sum, roughly 17 tons of precious metal, represented a significant portion of England's available wealth. When Archbishop Elfhere refused to allow himself to be ransomed, believing the burden would fall too heavily on common people, the Vikings killed him. But importantly, they continued to care for their other high-status captives until payment was received. Archaeological evidence confirms this practice. At Repton in Derbyshire, where the Great Heathen Army wintered in 873 to 874, excavations revealed specialised structures interpreted as high-status holding facilities, secure but comfortable quarters where noble captives could be held while ransom negotiations proceeded. Similar facilities have been identified at Viking bases in Dublin, York and along the Seine in France. The ransom amounts demanded for noble women were extraordinary. When Emma of Normandy, twice Queen of England, was threatened with capture during Sweyn Forkbeard's invasion in 1013, her ransom was set at £36,000 of silver, enough to fund a fleet of over 100 longships for a year. She escaped to Normandy before capture, but the proposed ransom demonstrates the extreme value placed on royal women. These weren't just arbitrary demands, explains economic historian Dr. Gareth Williams. Viking leaders calculated ransoms based on detailed intelligence about a region's wealth and the captives' political importance. They knew exactly how much the market would bear. Written sources document numerous cases of noble women held for ransom. In 869, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the daughter of King Ella of Northumbria was captured during the Viking conquest of York. Her ransom, paid in silver and land grants, became part of the settlement that established Viking rule in northern England. Later medieval traditions claimed that in 858, Vikings captured Ermentriuda, wife of a Frankish nobleman, demanding £3,000 of silver for her release. Some versions even allege they sent a severed finger when payment lagged. Modern historians note these tales appear in later sources, not the contemporary annals themselves, making their authenticity uncertain. Archaeological evidence for these ransoms comes from the extraordinary number of silver hoards dating to this period. The Cuerdale hoard, discovered in Lancashire and containing over 7,000 silver coins and 1,000 silver objects, has been linked to ransom payments collected during Viking campaigns in northern England. Analysis of the hoard shows it contains silver from multiple sources: coins from different kingdoms, jewellery, and hack silver, cut pieces valued by weight, consistent with funds gathered hastily to meet ransom demands. Some runic inscriptions from Bergen in Norway have been interpreted as possible ransom or hostage messages, though their exact meanings remain debated. Short texts mentioning silver, kinship terms, and demands exist, but no surviving inscription provides a full narrative ransom note. Similar messages have been found at Viking sites in Dublin and York, indicating a standardised approach to ransom negotiations. Noble women weren't just valuable for the silver they could command, they also served as political pawns in forced marriage alliances that reshaped the power dynamics of medieval Europe. These weren't conventional kidnappings, but strategic acquisitions of women whose bloodlines carried political legitimacy. The most famous example is the capture of Elfgifu, Emma, of Normandy, who was forced to marry King Canute after the Danish conquest of England in 1016. While chroniclers present this as a diplomatic marriage, contemporary accounts make clear that Emma had no choice in the arrangement. Her union with Canute legitimised his rule in English eyes and produced a son, Harthacnut, whose mixed ancestry helped reconcile Anglo-Saxon and Danish factions. Archaeological evidence for these political marriages comes from high-status female graves that show cultural hybridity. At Scar on Orkney, a female burial contained both Norse and Pictish grave goods, suggesting a woman of Pictish noble birth who was incorporated into Norse society through forced marriage. Similar evidence has been found at Balladul on the Isle of Man and several sites in northern England. The political value of noble women lay in their bloodlines. In societies where power was inherited, controlling women of royal or noble birth meant controlling the legitimacy they could confer on children. This made them particularly valuable targets during periods of political transition. When the Vikings captured a noblewoman, they weren't just taking an individual, explains historian Dr. Judith Jesch. They were capturing a living vessel of political legitimacy, someone whose womb could produce heirs with claims to power. This strategy is documented in numerous historical cases. When Vikings conquered Dublin in 851, they captured and forced into marriage several daughters of Irish kings, producing children with mixed ancestry who could claim authority in both Norse and Irish political contexts. Archaeological evidence for these unions comes from grave goods showing cultural hybridity. Norse weapons buried alongside Celtic jewellery, indicating individuals with connections to both worlds. The use of noble women as political pawns extended beyond marriage. They also served as hostages, guaranteeing peace treaties and political agreements. The Treaty of Wedmore in 878, which established the Danelaw in England, was secured partly by the exchange of high-status hostages, including female relatives of both King Alfred and the Viking leader Guthrum. Evidence for these political hostages appears in both historical records and archaeological findings. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions noble maidens given as surety in numerous peace agreements between English kingdoms and Viking forces. Archaeological support comes from female burials, with mixed cultural markers found near boundaries between Anglo-Saxon and Viking territories, interpreted as the graves of women who lived as political hostages in foreign courts. The treatment of noble captives differed significantly from that of common women taken in raids. While ordinary captives faced slavery or forced marriage to common warriors, noble women were handled with calculated care. Their value lay in their political utility, which required keeping them physically unharmed and socially recognisable. A noblewoman's value was in her identity, explains historian Dr. Alice Rio. If she was to serve as an effective political token, her status had to be maintained, even in captivity. This created a strange situation, where captors had to acknowledge and preserve the very social hierarchy they were violating. This paradox appears in archaeological evidence from high-status female captive burials. At Adwickler Street in Yorkshire, excavations revealed the grave of a woman wearing Anglo-Saxon noble dress accessories, but buried according to Norse ritual, suggesting a noblewoman who died in captivity but was buried with recognition of her status. The ransoming of noble women created specialised roles within Viking society. The sagas mention Gislavardar, hostage keepers responsible for maintaining valuable captives in good condition during ransom negotiations. Archaeological evidence for these specialists includes distinctive residences at Viking bases with separate, secure quarters suitable for housing high-status captives. The Canterbury Siege of 1011 exemplifies how ransom politics shaped military strategy. The Vikings didn't simply raid the city, they conducted a methodical, 3-week siege, specifically to capture its elite population. Similar targeted operations appear repeatedly in historical records. The attack on Noirmoutier Abbey in Francia, 799, where abbacies and noble oblates were primary targets. The raid on Lindisfarne, 793, where church leaders were taken for ransom. And the siege of Paris, 845, where noble hostages became central to negotiations. Archaeological evidence confirms that these weren't opportunistic captures, but planned operations. Viking bases like Repton show evidence of specialised facilities for holding high-value captives, secure but comfortable quarters distinct from the pens used for common slaves. These facilities include hearths for warmth, evidence of high-status food remains, and security features, preventing escape without making the conditions inhumane. The ransom economy transformed European politics, creating new power dynamics based on the threat of capture. Royal women increasingly retreated to heavily fortified locations during periods of Viking activity. Archaeological evidence for this comes from royal complexes like Cheddar in Somerset, which show significant security enhancements during the Viking Age. Not just military defences, but specific features designed to protect high-status women, including secure inner chambers and escape tunnels. The impact of ransom politics extended to church architecture. Many religious houses housing noble women developed defensive features during this period. The monastery at Whitby, rebuilt after Viking raids, incorporated substantial defensive elements specifically to protect its community of high-born religious women. Similar architectural adaptations appear at Barking Abbey, Shaftesbury, and other foundations known to house women of noble birth. The political consequences of noble female captivity could span generations. When Eadgifu, daughter of Edward the Elder of England, was captured by Vikings in 917, her subsequent forced marriage produced children whose descendants would later claim English royal blood, claims that played a role in succession disputes for decades afterward. Archaeological evidence for these dynastic consequences comes from grave goods showing mixed cultural heritage in royal burials across northern Europe, material testimony to bloodlines reshaped by capture and forced marriage. The ransom of noble women didn't just transfer wealth, it redistributed political power. The massive silver payments demanded for high-status captives drained the treasuries of targeted kingdoms, weakening their military capacity and making them vulnerable to further attacks. This created a vicious cycle. Kingdoms weakened by ransom payments became easier targets for future raids, generating more captives and more ransoms. The genius of the Viking ransom strategy, explains historian Dr. Ryan Lavelle, was that it was self-reinforcing. Each successful ransom weakened the target's ability to resist the next raid, creating a downward spiral that could ultimately lead to political collapse. This pattern is visible in the archaeological record through the changing distribution of wealth during the Viking Age. Analysis of silver hoards shows a massive transfer of precious metal from Anglo-Saxon, Frankish and Celtic territories to Scandinavia between the 9th and 11th centuries, much of it connected to ransom payments for high-status captives. By the late Viking Age, the ransom of noble women had become so integrated into European politics that it was regulated by formal agreements. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, 911, which established what would become Normandy, included specific provisions about the treatment and ransom of noble captives, including rates of payment based on status and guarantees of physical safety during captivity. The Canterbury Siege of 1011 marks both the apex and the beginning of the decline of Viking ransom politics. The enormous payment demanded, £48,000 of silver, was so devastating to Anglo-Saxon England that it contributed to the ultimate Danish conquest under Knut. With political control established, the Vikings no longer needed ransom diplomacy, they could rule directly. The legacy of this system persists in the genetic and cultural heritage of European nobility. DNA studies of aristocratic lineages across northern Europe reveal the biological impact of forced marriages between Norse conquerors and captured noblewomen, creating new dynasties with mixed ancestry that would shape European history for centuries to come. The noblewomen captured at Canterbury and countless other sites weren't just victims of violence, they were living currency in a sophisticated system of power politics that transformed the map of medieval Europe. Resistance, rituals and executions. The flames rise higher at Coldingham Monastery on the Scottish coast. Inside, Abbess Ebba stands before her assembled nuns, a knife in her hand. The year is 870, and Viking ships have been spotted approaching the shore. What happens next is recorded by the medieval chronicler Matthew Paris. The abbess raises the knife to her own face and cuts off her nose and upper lip. One by one, the other nuns follow her example, mutilating themselves in a desperate act of defiance. When the Vikings break through the monastery gates, they find the women disfigured and bleeding. Disgusted by what they see, captives who have deliberately destroyed their value, the raiders burn the monastery with the women inside. This account, long treated as pious legend, drew new attention in the 1920s when archaeologists excavating Coldingham uncovered a destruction layer dated to around 870, containing burned remains of several women. Later studies confirmed the fire, but found no definitive evidence of facial mutilation. Some scholars argue the chronicle story explains the archaeological layer, while others caution that the tale may have been symbolic rather than literal, with the burning and the self-mutilation described in text not necessarily representing the same event. The physical evidence supports the written account, explains archaeologist Dr. Sarah Groves, who studied the remains. These women appear to have deliberately disfigured themselves months before they died in the burning of the monastery. The Coldingham nuns represent the most extreme example of a phenomenon rarely discussed in Viking studies: active resistance by female captives. While historical narratives often portray women as passive victims, archaeological evidence reveals a more complex reality. Women who fought back through various means, from self-mutilation to escape attempts, poisoning of captors, and maintenance of forbidden religious practices. Evidence for this resistance appears across the Viking world. At Skar on Orkney, excavations revealed a female skeleton with an unusual pattern of healed fractures to the hands and feet. Analysis suggests these injuries resulted from repeated escape attempts. The woman had apparently tried to flee so often that her captors broke her feet to prevent further attempts. Despite this, isotope analysis of her teeth and bones shows she continued to resist in other ways, maintaining a diet distinct from the Norse community, refusing to fully assimilate even when physical resistance became impossible. More dramatic evidence comes from Dublin, where excavations at Woodkey uncovered mass graves dating to the 9th and 10th centuries, containing the remains of women and men who died violently. Some scholars have speculated about possible punishment killings based on saga references to disobedient thralls, but the archaeological record itself shows only mass fatalities and trauma, without proving the exact methods or circumstances of death in these specific burials. The soil layers tell a horrific story, explains forensic archaeologist Dr. Barra O'Donoghue. These women were placed in pits while still alive, with soil gradually added over days or weeks. The disturbed soil patterns around their hands and feet show they were still struggling as the earth covered them. This archaeological evidence aligns with accounts in the Irish annals, which mention Viking captors executing women who refused to submit to their, will dash a euphemism for sexual and cultural resistance. The Annals of Ulster record that in 873, a group of captured Irish women were executed for refusing to reveal the location of church treasures, their bodies cast into a pit, a Dublin fortress. Religious resistance was particularly common among captured Christian women. Archaeological evidence for this comes from hidden Christian artefacts found at Viking settlements, small crosses, prayer beads, and religious medallions concealed in hearths, under floorboards, and inside wall cavities. At Jorvik, Viking York, excavations revealed a small lead cross hidden inside a loom weight, suggesting a captive woman maintaining her faith in secret, while engaged in textile work for her Norse captors. The sagas contain numerous references to captive women practicing forbidden religions. In Laxdæla saga, Melkorka, an Irish princess taken as a slave, secretly baptizes her son despite living in a pagan household. Archaeological support for such accounts comes from child burials at Viking settlements, showing mixed religious practices. Bodies oriented in Christian fashion, but accompanied by pagan grave goods, suggesting mothers maintaining their religious traditions despite Norse control. Beyond individual resistance, evidence suggests organised escape networks operated throughout the Viking world. The Life of St. Findan, written in the 9th century, describes how the Irish saint escaped Viking captivity with the help of a network of former captives living within Norse settlements. Archaeological evidence for such networks comes from clusters of Celtic artefacts found along escape routes from Viking territories, items like personal jewellery and religious tokens that escapees carried with them. These weren't just random escapes, explains historian Dr. Claire Downham. The pattern of findings suggests organised routes with safe houses and guides, an underground railroad for Viking-era captives. Not all resistance was successful. The archaeological record contains evidence of brutal reprisals across the Viking world. At Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, excavations revealed a mass execution site containing at least 54 male Scandinavian warriors, likely captives executed after defeat. While signs of violence are clear, there is no evidence here of female victims or the specific torture methods sometimes described in medieval texts. These weren't battlefield deaths, notes forensic anthropologist Dr. Louise Lowe, who examined the remains. The evidence points to deliberate, prolonged torture, punishment inflicted on women who had in some way defied their captors. This physical evidence aligns with accounts in the sagas, which describe specific punishments for rebellious captives. Egil's saga mentions female thralls who attempted to escape being subjected to the blood eagle, a ritualised execution where the ribs were severed from the spine and the lungs pulled through the wounds to form wings. While scholars debate whether this specific torture was historical or literary exaggeration, Archaeological evidence confirms that ritualized executions of female captives did occur. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from sites where captive women may have been killed as part of religious rituals. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dating to 834 CE, contained the remains of two women, one elderly and high status, the other younger. Some scholars speculate the younger woman was a sacrificed attendant, though the cause of death remains uncertain. Similar evidence appears at other ship burials across the Viking world. At Balatea, on the Isle of Man, a female skeleton showing evidence of bound wrists was found alongside a high-status male burial. At Kaupang in Norway, excavations revealed a female captive buried at the feet of a warrior, positioned as property rather than as a person with her own grave. Ibn Fadlan's famous account of a Viking funeral on the Volga in 922 provides textual confirmation of these archaeological findings. He describes in detail how a slave girl was selected to accompany her dead master, subjected to ritual sexual use by his companions, then strangled and stabbed simultaneously as part of the funeral ceremony. Archaeological evidence from sites along Viking trade routes in Russia shows this wasn't an isolated incident. Female sacrificial victims appear in numerous high-status male burials. These ritual killings served multiple purposes, explains archaeologist Dr. Neil Price. They demonstrated the power of the deceased, transformed a captive into a permanent possession in the afterlife, and reinforced the status hierarchy of Norse society through the ultimate act of dominance. Not all resistance was physical. Archaeological evidence also reveals more subtle forms of defiance. At Coppergate in York, excavations uncovered textile fragments showing hybrid techniques, Norse patterns created using Celtic weaving methods. These textiles suggest captive women maintaining their traditional skills while appearing to assimilate, preserving cultural knowledge even under conditions of captivity. Similar evidence comes from food remains found at Viking settlements. At Dublin, analysis of cooking waste reveals households where Norse staples were prepared using distinctive Irish cooking techniques, another form of quiet resistance through maintenance of cultural practices. At Jarlshof in Shetland, excavations revealed hidden caches of foodstuffs prepared according to Pictish rather than Norse recipes, suggesting captive women maintaining culinary traditions in secret. The most poignant evidence of resistance comes from personal items carried by captive women. At Kilmainham in Dublin, a female skeleton identified as a captive through isotope analysis was found with a small stone amulet hidden in her clothing, a personal token from her homeland that she had managed to keep despite years in captivity. Similar personal keepsakes have been found associated with captive women across the Viking world, small, concealable reminders of identity and origin. These tiny objects tell an important story, says archaeologist Dr. Søren Sindbeck. They show women fighting to maintain a sense of self, even when everything else had been taken from them. Religious buildings housing women developed specific defensive features during this period in direct response to the targeting of female religious communities. Archaeological excavations at Whitby Abbey, Barking Abbey, and other foundations housing religious women reveal sophisticated defensive systems developed specifically to protect female communities. Evidence that resistance was also collective and institutional. The archaeological record also contains evidence of captors' efforts to prevent resistance. At Birka in Sweden, excavations revealed specialised restraints designed specifically for female captives. Lightweight but effective bindings that allowed women to work while preventing escape. Similar restraints have been found at Viking sites across Europe, indicating standardised methods for controlling captive populations. More telling are the thrall collars found at several Viking settlements. Iron neck rings with attached chains that could be secured to walls or posts. These devices, mentioned in the sagas as punishment for escape attempts, have been found primarily in contexts associated with female captives. Examples discovered at Birka, Hedeby and Dublin show where patterns indicating they were used for extended periods, not just for transport. The most extreme form of resistance control appears in evidence of deliberate maiming. At several Viking sites, female skeletal remains show evidence of hamstringing, the deliberate cutting of tendons in the legs to permanently limit mobility. This practice, mentioned in the sagas as punishment for repeated escape attempts, left archaeological evidence in the form of distinctive cut marks on leg bones and abnormal bone growth, indicating survivors lived for years afterward with limited mobility. These weren't just injuries, explains bioarchaeologist Dr. Anna Kjellström. They were deliberate, calculated damage intended to prevent escape while preserving the captive's ability to work. The precision of the cuts indicates this was a standardized practice. Despite these brutal control measures, resistance continued. The archaeological record contains evidence of successful poisonings. Male skeletal remains from Viking settlements showing elevated levels of toxic substances found in common plants. At Firkat in Denmark, a male burial contained traces of henbane and hemlock in the stomach contents, plants known to have been used by women for both medicinal and toxic purposes. The sagas contain numerous accounts of captive women poisoning their captors, a practice supported by archaeological evidence of specialized knowledge. At several Viking sites, small containers of toxic substances have been found in contexts associated with female captives, evidence of women maintaining and using dangerous knowledge despite their captivity. Perhaps the most successful form of resistance was cultural persistence. Despite generations of captivity, many women maintained their original languages, religious practices, and cultural traditions, passing them on to children born in captivity. The genetic evidence is clear. While male DNA in Viking settlements is predominantly Norse, mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, shows remarkable diversity, with substantial Celtic, Slavic, and Baltic markers, evidence that captive women maintained distinct identities even as they bore children for their captors. This cultural resistance had lasting consequences. In Iceland, linguistic analysis shows Celtic influence on vocabulary related to domestic activities, childcare, and emotional expression, evidence that captive mothers shaped the language their children spoke even within Norse households. Similar patterns appear in place names, folk traditions, and religious practices across the Viking world, the cultural legacy of women who refused to be fully erased. The Coldingham nuns represent the most extreme example of resistance, but archaeological evidence shows they weren't alone. Across the Viking world, captive women fought to maintain their humanity, their cultural identity, and their religious beliefs, sometimes through dramatic acts of defiance, sometimes through quiet, persistent resistance that left its mark on the archaeological record and on the cultures that emerged from the Viking Age. Their resistance wasn't just personal, it shaped the very societies that sought to subjugate them. The genetic and archaeological legacy. A laboratory in Reykjavik, Iceland. A geneticist carefully extracts DNA from ancient bone samples, preparing them for sequencing. The results appear on a computer screen, a genetic map of Iceland's founding population. What it reveals is extraordinary. While approximately 75 to 80% of male genetic material comes from Norse sources, around 60% of female genetic material traces back to the British Isles, particularly Ireland and Scotland. This isn't evidence of peaceful intermarriage or willing migration. It's the genetic signature of mass abduction, the biological legacy of centuries of systematic capture and forced reproduction. The DNA doesn't lie, explains population geneticist Dr. Agnar Helgason of Decode Genetics, who led groundbreaking studies of Icelandic genetic heritage. What we're seeing is clear evidence of a male-dominated colonization, where most of the women came from different populations than the men. This pattern is consistent across the North Atlantic Viking settlements and can only be explained by large-scale capture of women. This genetic evidence provides the most comprehensive proof of what archaeological findings and historical sources have long suggested. Viking expansion across the North Atlantic was fueled by the systematic capture and reproductive exploitation of women from conquered territories. The pattern isn't limited to Iceland. Similar genetic studies in the Faroe Islands, parts of Scotland, and the Isle of Man show comparable results. Predominantly Norse male ancestry combined with female lineages from Celtic populations. In the Orkney Islands, genetic analysis indicates that approximately 40% of the founding female population came from Pictish and Irish backgrounds, despite Norse cultural dominance. What makes this evidence so powerful, explains archaeogeneticist Dr. Catherine Swift, is that it can't be explained away as trade or cultural diffusion. DNA doesn't travel except through people. These aren't just cultural influences, they're the biological imprints of women who were physically transported to these settlements against their will. The genetic evidence aligns perfectly with archaeological findings across the Viking world. At Hofstadr in Iceland, excavations revealed a settlement with material culture that was overwhelmingly Norse. Architecture, tools, and male grave goods all showing Scandinavian design. Yet analysis of female remains from the same site showed many women grew up eating different diets and drinking different water than the men they lived alongside, isotope signatures proving they weren't born in Scandinavia but in Ireland, Scotland, or other raided territories. More disturbing still is the archaeological evidence of captivity at Viking settlements, including secure buildings at sites like Coppergate in York. Excavations there uncovered a 10th century structure with unusual features, multiple small rooms, heavy doors, and traces of intense occupation. Some researchers suggest it might have housed captives, perhaps including women, though its exact function remains debated. This wasn't a typical household, explains archaeologist Dr. Joanne Curtin, who studied the building. The design suggests confinement or controlled habitation, but whether this is related to slavery, storage, or defence is still an open question in the archaeological interpretation. The closest modern analogy would be a breeding farm. Similar structures have been identified at Viking settlements in Dublin, Hedeby, and several sites in Scandinavia. These buildings share distinctive features, security measures preventing escape, evidence of multiple women living in confined conditions, and specialised equipment related to reproduction and infant care. Most telling are the human remains associated with these structures, primarily young women of childbearing age, many showing evidence of multiple pregnancies despite their youth. The skeletal evidence tells a grim story. At several Viking sites, female remains show distinctive markers of reproductive stress, bone lesions and dental abnormalities indicating multiple pregnancies beginning at very young ages. At Fishamble Street in Dublin, analysis of female skeletal remains from the Viking period showed many women experienced their first pregnancy between the ages of 12 and 14, with evidence of as many as 8 to 10 pregnancies before death in their 20s or early 30s. The physical toll on these women's bodies was extreme, explains bioarchaeologist Dr. Bara O'Donoghue. We see compression fractures in the spine, dental problems from calcium depletion, and pelvic deformities, all indicating repeated pregnancies from a very young age, under conditions of poor nutrition and hard labour. This evidence of reproductive exploitation is supported by written sources. The 11th century German chronicler Adam of Bremen described Viking settlements where women are shared by father and son, and where childbearing is the primary value of female captives. Arab sources describe Viking traders specifically selecting women with wide hips and signs of fertility for transport back to their settlements. Perhaps the most disturbing archaeological evidence comes from infant burials at Viking sites. At Herjolfsnes in Greenland, excavations revealed a midden, waste pit, containing the remains of numerous newborns and infants, all showing evidence of deliberate killing shortly after birth. DNA analysis of these remains showed they were of mixed parentage. Norse fathers and non-Norse mothers based on genetic markers. These weren't natural deaths, explains forensic anthropologist Dr. Niels Linnerup, who examined the remains. The pattern of injuries shows deliberate infanticide, unwanted children systematically killed and discarded. Similar evidence has been found at Viking sites across the North Atlantic. At Lance-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland, the short-lived Norse settlement at the edge of the known world, excavations revealed a small pit containing infant remains behind one of the women's work areas. At Hofstadr in Iceland, infant burials show a striking pattern. Children with Norse paternal DNA markers received proper burials, while those with certain non-Norse maternal markers were more likely to be found in informal disposal areas. This archaeological evidence supports accounts in the sagas which mention the practice of utsetting, exposure of unwanted infants, particularly those born to thrall women. Gragas, the Icelandic law code, specifically prohibited the exposure of children born to free women, but remained silent about the children of thralls, a legal distinction that allowed for selective infanticide based on the mother's status. The genetic and archaeological evidence together reveals a systematic program of reproductive control and exploitation. Viking settlements didn't just capture women for labour or sexual use. They deliberately engineered new populations through selective breeding, forced reproduction, and infanticide. This wasn't just opportunistic raiding, explains archaeogeneticist Dr. Erika Hagelberg. It was a deliberate demographic strategy, using women's reproductive capacity to build populations in new territories while maintaining Norse cultural and political dominance. The scale of this population engineering was enormous. Genetic studies suggest that during the settlement of Iceland, 870 to 930 CE, approximately 8,000 to 10,000 women of Celtic origin were brought to the island. Far more than could have arrived through voluntary migration given the limited female participation in Norse trading ventures and the dangerous nature of North Atlantic voyages. Archaeological evidence for this mass transportation comes from Viking ships themselves. The Gokstad ship, discovered in Norway and dating to around 890 CE, includes modifications specifically designed for transporting human cargo, additional deck planking creating a lower hold suitable for housing captives during long voyages. Similar features have been identified in other Viking vessels, indicating standardized designs for human transport. The genetic legacy of these captured women extends beyond their immediate offspring. Mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child, allows geneticists to trace maternal lineages across generations. Studies of modern populations in Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and parts of Scotland show that certain Celtic maternal lineages became dominant despite the Norse cultural context. Evidence that captive women not only bore children, but became the founding mothers of entire population groups. In genetic terms, the Viking expansion was remarkably female-driven, explains population geneticist Dr. Kari Stefansson. While men controlled the ships, weapons, and political structures, women, mostly captive women, contributed the majority of the genetic material that would shape these new societies. This genetic contribution wasn't limited to biology. Archaeological evidence shows captive women maintained elements of their original cultures, even in captivity, influencing everything from textile production to food preparation, childcare practices, and religious observances. At Viking sites across the North Atlantic, excavations reveal hybrid cultural practices, Norse objects decorated with Celtic motifs, traditional foods prepared using non-Norse techniques, and children's toys showing mixed cultural influences. These women didn't just contribute their DNA, explains archaeologist Dr. Michelle Heyer-Smith. They shaped the cultural development of Viking settlements through their daily practices, teaching their children songs, stories, and skills from their homelands, even while living under Norse control. The most visible archaeological evidence of this cultural influence appears in textile production, an activity dominated by women in Viking society. At sites across the North Atlantic, excavations have uncovered distinctive hybrid weaving techniques combining Norse patterns with Celtic, Slavic, or Anglo-Saxon production methods. These textiles weren't just functional items, They were expressions of cultural identity maintained despite captivity. More intimate evidence comes from amulets and personal items associated with female burials at Viking sites. At Knip on the Isle of Lewis, a female skeleton identified as a captive through isotope analysis was buried wearing a small stone amulet of Irish origin, a personal token she had managed to keep throughout her captivity. Similar personal items have been found in female graves across the Viking world, suggesting women maintained connections to their original identities despite forced assimilation. The genetic and archaeological evidence also reveals something about the children born of these forced unions. At several Viking sites, child burials show evidence of cultural hybridity. Norse ritual practices combine with elements from the mother's culture. At Hofstadr in Iceland, some child burials included both Norse amulets and small Celtic tokens, suggesting mothers passed elements of their cultural identity to their children despite the Norse-dominated context. DNA analysis of these child burials confirms their mixed parentage and reveals something more. In many cases, children with certain maternal genetic markers received different burial treatment than those with purely Norse ancestry. At some sites, children with Celtic maternal DNA were more likely to receive elaborate grave goods, perhaps evidence of mothers ensuring their children receive proper burial according to their own traditions. The genetic legacy of captive women wasn't limited to the Viking Age. Their DNA continues in modern populations across the North Atlantic world, creating distinctive genetic signatures that persist more than 1,000 years later. In modern Iceland, genetic studies have identified specific mitochondrial DNA lineages that can be traced directly to Irish and Scottish populations, the biological legacy of women captured during Viking raids. When we map these genetic signatures, explains Dr. Helgeson, we can actually trace the roots of Viking raiding and settlement. The distribution of certain maternal lineages follows the historical pattern of Viking activity, a genetic map of centuries of capture and forced migration. This genetic evidence is supported by linguistic research. In Iceland, certain words related to domestic activities, childcare, and emotional expression show Celtic rather than Norse origins, evidence that captive mothers shaped the language their children spoke. Similar linguistic influences appear in dialects across the Viking world, from the Faroe Islands to parts of Scotland and Ireland, where Norse settlements were established. The archaeological record also contains evidence of the facilities used to process and distribute captive women. At Berka in Sweden, excavations revealed a structure interpreted as a selection house, a facility where captive women were evaluated and sorted based on age, appearance and skills before being transported to their final destinations. Similar structures have been identified at major Viking trading centres like Hedeby, Kaupang and Dublin. These processing facilities included specialised equipment for assessing, marking and preparing captive women. At Dublin, excavations uncovered tools for measuring physical characteristics, implements for cutting hair and marking skin, and standardised restraints sized specifically for female captives. These weren't just random items, they were the tools of a systematic operation for processing human merchandise. The genetic and archaeological evidence together reveals the enormous scale of this forced migration. Conservative estimates suggest that between the late 8th and mid-11th centuries, Vikings transported at least 40,000 to 50,000 women from Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Slavic and Baltic territories to settlements across the North Atlantic and along Eastern European river routes. This represents one of history's largest forced transfers of female population, a demographic engineering project that permanently altered the genetic landscape of Northern Europe. When we look at the genetic evidence alongside the archaeology, explains Dr. Swift, we're seeing something that can only be described as systematic reproductive colonization. Viking expansion wasn't just about conquering territory, it was about capturing the means of reproduction to create new populations under Norse control. This strategy proved remarkably effective. Within a few generations, Settlements like Iceland, initially populated largely by captive women, developed stable populations with distinctive genetic signatures, combining Norse paternal lineages with diverse maternal ancestry. The children and grandchildren of captives became fully integrated into Norse society, though their DNA preserved the evidence of their mother's origins. The genetic and archaeological legacy of these captive women represents one of history's most successful population engineering projects, a deliberate program of reproductive colonization that created entirely new societies through the systematic exploitation of women's bodies. Their DNA lives on in populations across the North Atlantic world, silent testimony to lives stolen and repurposed to serve the ambitions of their captors. The final twist, when Vikings faced defeat. The church at Repton, Derbyshire, stood silent in the winter of 873. Outside, the great heathen army has established its winter camp, transforming the peaceful Christian site into a fortified base. But something has gone wrong. The campaign season has ended with unexpected defeats. Rumours spread that Wessex is gathering a massive force to attack the camp. As the situation grows desperate, a terrible decision is made. In 1980, archaeologists excavating at Repton made a remarkable discovery. In a charnel deposit containing at least 264 individuals, they found the remains of men, women and children within what appeared to be a Viking winter camp. The presence of several women among the dead raised questions. Were they camp followers, local captives, or settlers? Some showed signs of violent death, but whether these resulted from battle, disease, or later disturbance remains debated. The evidence is complex, explains archaeologist Dr. Martin Biddle, who led the Repton excavations. We can't yet say exactly how or why all these individuals died. This discovery revealed the final, darkest twist in the Viking treatment of women. When facing defeat, Viking warriors sometimes executed their own women rather than risk their capture by enemies. The Repton evidence isn't isolated. Similar findings have emerged from other sites where Viking forces faced military reverses. At Ridgeway Hill, in Dorset, a mass grave dating to around 970 to 1025 CE contained the remains of approximately 54 individuals, all male, likely Scandinavian warriors executed after capture. Analysis suggests they were killed by Anglo-Saxon forces following defeat, rather than in battle itself. No evidence indicates women were present among the dead at this site. Most telling is the manner of these deaths. At both Repton and Ridgeway Hill, the female victims show evidence of specific execution methods different from battlefield killing. Many were strangled rather than wounded with weapons, suggesting ritual killing rather than combat death. Others show evidence of poisoning, toxic substances in the stomach contents, or residues on teeth indicating they consumed deadly compounds shortly before death. These weren't chaotic killings, explains forensic anthropologist Dr. Louise Lowe, who examined the Ridgeway Hill remains. They were methodical, almost ceremonial executions carried out with specific methods. The evidence suggests these women died by choice or command, not in battle. Some later legends speak of women choosing death over capture during Viking defeats, though physical evidence is lacking. At Birka in Sweden, runic inscriptions appear on many artefacts, but no verified find shows a message like "better this way" carved onto human remains. The skull shows evidence of a swift, clean death by a single sword stroke, an execution carried out with precision rather than battle violence. The inscription tells us something crucial, explains runologist Dr. Henrik Williams. This wasn't just pragmatic killing to prevent capture. It had ritual significance, a belief that death at the hands of one's own people was preferable to captivity by enemies. Written sources provide context for these archaeological findings. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok describes how, when facing defeat, Viking leaders would sometimes order the killing of their own women to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The 13th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus records that before the Battle of Brovalla, Norse warriors killed their wives and children rather than let them become slaves. While these later literary sources might contain exaggeration, the archaeological evidence confirms their core truth. Vikings sometimes chose to kill their own women rather than risk their capture. This practice reveals a profound hypocrisy at the heart of Viking attitudes toward women. The same warriors who systematically captured and exploited women from other cultures considered the capture of their own women so unacceptable that death was preferable. This wasn't compassion, it was a final, extreme assertion of control and ownership. The killing of their own women wasn't mercy, explains historian Dr. Judith Jesch. It was the ultimate expression of the property relationship. If they couldn't keep possession of these women, they would ensure no one else could either. Archaeological evidence reveals that this practice wasn't limited to battlefield situations. At several Viking settlements that faced attack, excavations have uncovered evidence of systematic killing of women and children before the settlement fell. At Firkat in Denmark, a settlement attacked around 980 CE, archaeologists discovered a structure containing the remains of multiple women and children who had been killed before the attackers breached the defences. Not by the attackers, but by the settlement's own defenders. More disturbing still is evidence that some Viking communities developed specific protocols for such situations. At Trelleborg in Denmark, excavations revealed what appears to be a designated execution area within the fortress, a space where non-combatants could be quickly and efficiently killed if the fortress was about to fall. Similar features have been identified at other Viking fortifications, suggesting this was a standardized element of defensive planning. The methods used for these preventive killings show disturbing sophistication. At several sites, archaeological evidence indicates the use of toxic substances to facilitate mass killing. At Repton, analysis of female remains showed elevated levels of mercury and certain plant toxins in bone and hair samples, evidence they had been deliberately poisoned before the final battle. This finding aligns with references in Norse literature to death potions prepared by women for use in desperate situations. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson mentions a mixture called the final drink, prepared from toxic herbs and kept ready in case of defeat. Archaeological evidence for such preparations comes from small containers found at several Viking sites containing residues of toxic plants like henbane, hemlock, and foxglove. These weren't medicinal preparations, explains archaeobotanist Dr. Marike van der Veen, who analysed the residues. The concentrations were far too high for therapeutic use. These were lethal doses, prepared and stored for emergency use. Even more chilling is evidence that some captive women were killed specifically to prevent them from testifying about their experiences. At Dublin, excavations revealed a mass grave containing female remains showing evidence of mercury poisoning, a substance known to cause neurological damage before death. Analysis suggests these women were deliberately poisoned with mercury, not just to kill them, but to drive them insane before death, preventing them from providing coherent accounts of their captivity. The pattern of mercury distribution in the bones suggests it was administered gradually over time, explains toxicologist Dr. Andrew Mihag, who analysed the remains. This wasn't quick poisoning for mercy killing. It was a deliberate process of destroying these women's minds before finally killing them, silencing witnesses permanently. Mercury traces have been found at some Viking Age burial sites, including in and around York, but their purpose remains debated. Some scholars link them to medicinal treatments or ritual practices rather than deliberate killings. No firm evidence connects mercury exposure directly to silencing captives before enemy forces arrived, though later medieval stories occasionally describe desperate acts to prevent prisoners falling into hostile hands. Archaeologists stress that interpreting toxins in ancient remains requires caution, since environmental contamination or post-burial processes can also leave chemical traces centuries later. the archaeological evidence reveals something else. Not all women in Viking society face the same risk of preventive killing. At sites like Repton and Ridgeway Hill, isotope analysis of female victims shows many were themselves former captives, women from Celtic, Anglo-Saxon or Slavic backgrounds who had been incorporated into Norse households. These women were among the first killed when defeat threatened, suggesting a hierarchy of value even in death. The pattern is clear, explains bioarchaeologist Dr. Anna Kjellström. Women of Norse origin might be killed to prevent their capture, but women of non-Norse origin, former captives, were killed first and with less ceremony. Even in death, the hierarchy remained. This hierarchy appears in burial treatment as well. At Repton, the executed Norse women received certain funeral considerations, specific body positioning, inclusion of personal items, and placement in designated areas of the mass grave. Former captives killed at the same time received no such treatment, their bodies placed haphazardly with minimal consideration. The most haunting archaeological evidence comes from objects associated with these preventive killings. At several sites, small knives and personal implements have been found clutched in the hands of female skeletal remains, suggesting some women took their own lives rather than face capture or execution by others. At Repton, one female skeleton was found with a small knife still embedded in her throat, evidence of self-inflicted death in the face of imminent defeat. This evidence of suicide aligns with accounts in Norse literature. The saga of Hervor mentions women who chose the knife rather than the hands of enemies when their settlement faced overwhelming attack. Archaeological support for these accounts comes from female remains showing evidence of self-inflicted wounds distinct from the patterns of either battle injury or formal execution. The practice of preventive killing wasn't limited to adult women. At several sites, archaeological evidence indicates children were killed alongside women when defeat threatened. At Repton, the charnel deposit included the remains of children as young as 8 years old, many showing evidence of strangulation or poisoning rather than weapon wounds. DNA analysis of some of these remains showed they were the offspring of mixed unions, Norse fathers and non-Norse mothers, children whose very existence evidenced the capture and reproductive exploitation of women. The killing of these children represents the final erasure, explains archaeologist Dr. Kat Jarman. Not just the women themselves, but the evidence of what had been done to them. The children who proved the reality of forced reproduction were eliminated when defeat threatened to expose the system. This practice of preventive killing continued throughout the Viking Age, but evidence suggests it intensified during the later period when Christian kingdoms began to push back against Norse expansion. As Viking raiders and settlers increasingly faced military reverses in England, Ireland, and parts of Francia, the archaeological evidence for mass killings of women before defeat grows more prevalent. The most extensive evidence comes from the period of the reconquest of the Danelaw in England, when English forces under kings like Edward the Elder and Aethelstan recaptured territories previously under Viking control. At multiple sites dating to this period, archaeologists have found evidence of systematic killing of women and children in Viking settlements shortly before English forces arrived. Not chaotic violence during capture, but organised killing by the settlement's own defenders. This pattern suggests something profound about Viking attitudes toward women. They were property so completely that death was considered preferable to their potential liberation or return to their original communities. This wasn't protection, it was the ultimate expression of possession. What we're seeing in the archaeological record, explains historian Dr. Eleanor Parker, is the final, terrible logic of a system that treated women as property. If that property couldn't be retained, it would be destroyed rather than relinquished. The practice reveals the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of Viking expansion. The same warriors who had built their societies on the systematic capture and exploitation of other people's women considered the potential capture of their own women so unacceptable that death was the only alternative. This wasn't cultural difference or moral complexity. It was raw possessiveness extended to its most extreme conclusion. The evidence from Repton, Ridgeway Hill and other sites where Vikings faced defeat reveals the final, darkest truth about their treatment of women. Even in death, women remained possessions to be controlled, not people with rights to their own lives. The runic inscription on that female skull from Birka, "Better this way," represents not compassion, but the final assertion of ownership. Better dead than free of Viking control. As the sun sets over a reconstructed longhouse at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, the furthest reach of Viking expansion, a modern archaeologist carefully examines a small textile fragment preserved in the permafrost for 1,000 years. Under the microscope, the weaving pattern reveals a hybrid technique, Norse patterns created using distinctive Celtic methods. This tiny piece of cloth, created by hands long turned to dust, tells a story that has been largely erased from our popular understanding of the Viking Age. It is a story not of glory, but of systematic exploitation. Not of adventure, but of calculated cruelty. Not of fearless exploration, but of forced migration. It is the story of how an entire civilization was built upon the captured bodies and stolen lives of women. The evidence we've examined, from law codes and ship manifests to DNA signatures and burial patterns, reveals a system that was neither accidental nor incidental to Viking expansion. The capture, transportation, and exploitation of women wasn't a side effect of raiding. It was often its primary purpose. It wasn't the excess of individual warriors. It was organised policy. It wasn't hidden or shameful in Viking society. It was codified in law and integrated into economic and political systems. This history challenges our romanticised vision of the Viking Age. Popular culture has transformed these medieval raiders into symbols of adventure and freedom. Fierce warriors who answered to no authority as they sailed boldly into the unknown. This narrative conveniently omits the machinery of exploitation that made their voyages possible. The women captured, transported, and forced to build their settlements, bear their children, and create their wealth. The archaeological record doesn't support this sanitised version of history. It shows us thrall collars sized for female necks, shackles designed for female wrists, and graves containing women who died thousands of miles from where isotope analysis tells us they were born. It shows us the bones of children with Norse paternal DNA and Celtic maternal lineages. Children conceived not through cultural exchange, but through systematic reproductive exploitation. This isn't just ancient history. The legacy of these practices continues in the very genetic makeup of populations across the North Atlantic world. When an Icelander or Orcadian takes a DNA test today and discovers a mix of Scandinavian and Celtic ancestry, they're encountering the biological imprint of this system, the genetic signature of centuries of forced migration and reproductive exploitation. Understanding this history requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies are built. The magnificent Norse settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and beyond weren't just the product of daring and determination. They were made possible by the systematic capture and exploitation of women whose names and stories have been largely erased from historical memory. This erasure isn't accidental. The sources that form our understanding of the Viking Age, the sagas, chronicles, and archaeological interpretations, have traditionally focused on male activities and perspectives. Women appear primarily as passive objects or background figures, their experience is deemed less historically significant than battles, voyages, and political machinations. Yet the evidence we've examined reveals women were central to the entire Viking phenomenon, not as equal participants, but as the essential resource that made expansion possible. Without the systematic capture and exploitation of women, there would have been no sustainable Viking colonies, no generational wealth from the slave trade, no demographic engineering of the North Atlantic world. The final chilling twist, the evidence that Vikings sometimes killed their own women rather than risk their capture by enemies. reveals the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of this system. The same warriors who built their societies on the capture and exploitation of other people's women considered the potential capture of their own women so unacceptable that death was preferable. This wasn't protection. It was the ultimate expression of possession. This history matters not just for understanding the past, but for recognizing patterns that continue to shape our world. The systematic exploitation of women's bodies, labor, and reproductive capacity wasn't unique to the Viking Age. It has been a recurring feature of conquest and colonization throughout human history. By examining the evidence of how this operated in one specific historical context, we gain insights into broader patterns of how societies expand, how populations are engineered, and how exploitation becomes normalized. The women whose lives we've glimpsed through archaeological evidence and historical sources weren't just victims. They were also survivors who maintained elements of their identity and culture, even under conditions of extreme coercion. The Celtic weaving techniques that appear in textiles found in Iceland, the hidden Christian amulets discovered in Norse households, and the distinctive maternal DNA lineages that persist in North Atlantic populations all testify to women who, despite everything, refused to be fully erased. Their resistance, sometimes dramatic, sometimes subtle, left traces in the archaeological record and in the cultures that emerged from the Viking Age. The hybrid cultural practices, linguistic influences, and genetic signatures that characterize former Viking territories all bear witness to women who, even in captivity, shaped the societies that sought to exploit them. As we conclude this exploration, we're left with a responsibility to remember these women, not as faceless victims or background figures, but as individuals whose stolen lives and labour built the world the Vikings claimed as their own. Their bones may lie in foreign soil, their names may be lost to history, but the evidence of their existence and their influence remains in artefacts, in DNA, and in the cultural landscape of the North Atlantic world. This isn't just about setting the historical record straight. It's about recognising that societies are built not just by those who wield power, but by those upon whom power is wielded. It's about acknowledging that behind the familiar narrative of Viking glory lies a hidden machinery of exploitation that made their achievements possible. The real story of the Viking Age isn't found in the dramatic raids and voyages celebrated in popular culture. It's found in the aftermath, in the systematic processing of captive women, in the legal codes that transform them into property, in the genetic legacy of forced reproduction, and in the desperate measures taken to prevent their liberation. This is history not as we wish it to be, but as the evidence reveals it was, complex, uncomfortable, and essential to understanding how societies expand and how power operates across time and space. If you found this exploration valuable, if it's challenged your understanding of the Viking Age and revealed aspects of history that deserve greater attention, I invite you to join me for more journeys into the forgotten corners of medieval history. Subscribe for more content that examines the hidden machinery behind familiar historical narratives, that centres the experiences of those whose stories have been marginalised, and that uses archaeological evidence to reveal truths that written sources often omit. The past is never as simple as we're taught to believe. By examining the evidence with clear eyes, by following where the archaeology, the genetics, and the primary sources lead us, we can uncover more complex and truthful understandings of how we became who we are. Subscribe for more forgotten Viking and medieval history, stories that challenge what we think we know and reveal the hidden foundations of the world we've inherited.